Hi there, I'm Mel Schenck, an author and architect in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. In addition to its expression of Vietnamese identity, using the vocabulary of modernism, Vietnamese modernist architecture of the mid-20th century responded in innovative ways to resist the impacts of the tropical climate while enhancing the experience of natural phenomena in the environment. This video provides the context and details of the methods used in Vietnamese modernist architecture to accomplish these objectives. This presentation was originally presented on 27 January 2022 to the design studio of Professor Erik L'Heureux in the Department of Architecture of the National University of Singapore. Thank you to Professor L'Heureux for inviting me to present ideas about how Vietnamese mid-century modernist architecture accommodated the tropical climate and how we might be able to extend the productive lives of these heritage buildings. When you read the histories of modernist architecture until the last decades of the 20th century, they were primarily descriptive. They answered the questions: what does modernist architecture look like? How does it compare with classical architecture? What are the elements used in modernist compositions? These books define the vocabulary and characteristics of modernism. My book, Southern Vietnamese Modernist Architecture, follows that model and answers these kinds of questions. This photograph shows the 1955 Esso building that graced downtown Ho Chi Minh City before it was demolished in 2011. My primary objective became to record and catalog this amazing strain of architecture before it all disappears, and a lot of it has since the book was published. So I view my book as a record of the accomplishment of the Vietnamese people in developing and building this architecture that expressed their identity in the industrial age. But architectural history has become much more interesting nowadays as questions about the underlying circumstances for development of an architecture and the overlying cultural and historical influences on that architecture that are now the norm. Vietnamese modernist architecture really deserves this kind of critical analysis from many different perspectives. But for understandable reasons, that is not likely to come from Vietnamese scholars anytime soon. In his recent paper, entitled Tropical Comforts in Vietnam, American Professor Andrew Cruz wrote, in English language histories of Vietnamese architecture, the nomenclature used to describe screen walls is commonly associated with an architectural modernism that favors their role in sun shading rather than ventilation. I admit that my constant use of the term brise soleil definitely connotes sun shading. My objective in the book was to catalog elements such as brise soleil or screen walls as parts in the design vocabulary of Vietnamese mid-century modernist architecture, in addition to their functions. While he criticizes the modern preoccupation with sun shading, I think that it is actually an important tool of the mid-century Vietnamese modernists in creating harmonious compositions. I think they are often used decoratively as architectonic elements in these compositions. This vocabulary of Vietnamese modernism became an important kit of parts for the Vietnamese people themselves to design their own urban shop houses and rural houses. But the Vietnamese architects were dedicated to using this vocabulary to accommodate the tropical climate. They had studied Vietnamese traditional architecture very closely and had firsthand experience with how these elements could mitigate harmful effects or enhance desired effects. So I'll proceed now to take that vocabulary of elements and discuss how they contributed to mitigating the tropical climate in the Vietnamese buildings and the effects on the people that occupied those buildings. First, I want to cover the buildings that use full wall brise-soleil screens, such as the General Science Library, because in these cases, the screen walls definitely do the work of facilitating natural ventilation, as well as blocking the sun. In cases like the library here, the brise-soleil wall appears from the outside as the only exterior wall, but it is usually backed up with a corridor and a weather-resistant wall beyond that. In the library, the corridor behind the screen wall provides access to toilet rooms at the ends of the building. But the most important function of the screen wall is to reduce heat gain into the building by blocking the sun. After air penetrates through this screen wall and has its velocity reduced as a result, it makes its way into the reading rooms beyond the corridor through openings in the weather wall, which in this case is mostly glass with open glass doors. Before we leave the library, I also want to point out an innovation that tempered the air a bit before it traversed the reading rooms within the library. The design includes a water moat across the entire front facade of the library building. My fifth and final year of undergraduate architectural education was in 1970, if you can imagine that. On 24 April of that year, the first Earth Day was observed. Teach-ins were organized in all of the universities across America and around the world to raise awareness of environmental issues. And for many of us, this was the first time we became more aware of these issues and how they might be addressed. At that time, there was a focus on passive solar techniques for building architecture, at least at the teach-in that I attended. So here in Vietnam, at that time, we already have a passive strategy design in a building that probably makes it one of the first green buildings in the world. In some industrial applications where the full-size brise-soleil wall is used, it often appears to be purely decorative, perhaps as a way to provide identity for the company or product. You can see in this photo that the brise-soleil is a false front for the factory. Similarly, in this factory, the giant brise-soleil has weather exposure to the outside on both sides of the screen wall. So it again is purely decorative in that portion of the wall above the large entry port. In preparation for this presentation, I went back through my book and collection of other photographs of buildings to determine some sense of how screens or brise-soleil were used. In my cursory analysis, many of these elements were used decoratively. Once you tear your eyes away from those decorative architectonic shapes in the guardrails, you perhaps might then see the louvered openings towards the top of the walls on each level. The real work of providing natural ventilation was through louvered openings or ventilation blocks at the tops of the exterior wall, as well as all interior partitions on each level. It seems that it took the French architects until the first decade of the 20th century to finally figure out that natural ventilation was necessary to provide a modicum of thermal comfort within their buildings in the tropical climate. The Municipal Theater, or the Opera House, in downtown Saigon was completed for occupancy in 1900. But it didn't take long to realize that the extreme heat and humidity throughout most of the year made it impossible to use the building. So the theater season was limited to the 4 cooler months from October to January. French architects such as Ernest Hébrard studied traditional Vietnamese architecture in the early 20th century to determine how they could similarly adapt their architecture to the tropical climate. French colonial buildings in the following decades finally used ventilation openings above the windows as high as possible below the ceiling of the rooms within. By that time, electricity was more widely available, and electric ceiling fans could also be used to keep the air moving. One of the earliest modernist buildings to use ventilation screens was the apartment building at 14 Ton Duc Dam Street in the banking district of Old Saigon, constructed in the late 1930s. In this case, ventilation screens were placed above and below all window openings to create circulation of air in the interior spaces. Almost all Vietnamese modernist buildings in the mid-century used ventilation louvers high on the exterior wall at each level, but they were often unobtrusive in design and often hidden by elements such as shading or decorative purposes, especially in double wall construction. Most of the Vietnamese compositions use the double wall technique with a corridor or loggia outside of the exterior wall with an apparent outer wall of decorative elements composing that wall, including screens. This is the most common configuration in Vietnamese modernist architecture of the mid-century. The Vietnamese modernist architects had learned from their study of Vietnamese traditional architecture the importance of the shading capabilities of the double wall construction of loggias and exterior corridors by understanding the value of the ground floor verandas in the traditional houses. This villa shows that even without double wall construction, the wide roof and floor overhangs provide the same shading values that the ground floor verandas provided, and also keep the torrential rains away from the wall openings. Huge portions of neighborhoods in Saigon were damaged by warfare in 1968, leaving thousands of people homeless. The government and donor nations responded by building several mass housing complexes in a hurry within a year and a half. Over 50 years later, most of these projects are still in good condition, and the occupants like them because they have good locations in the inner city. Certainly in these housing complexes, air conditioning was not even considered due to its unavailability and high costs of electrical power. Therefore, the exterior corridors on the floor above served to shade the exterior walls below from direct sun so the interiors would not heat up so much during the daytime. Ventilation louvers were provided at the tops of the walls in each of the apartment units, so ventilation could still be provided at any time the doors were closed, such as at night. Some of the elements that make up the apparent outer wall had shading functions, but many, if we want to admit it, are added for decorative purposes in the composition. This contributed to a modernist architecture that departed from global modernist architecture in principle and created a more vibrant, rich architecture with spirit. These elements provided the primary pieces of the Vietnamese modernist vocabulary. Last year, in the first book published about Vietnamese modernist architecture, written by a Vietnamese author, Pham Thu Vinh cataloged the numerous ways the Vietnamese architects used sun shading elements to purposefully create constantly changing decorative shadows on the surfaces behind them. So the shadows also became important design elements in these compositions. Again, this was an important part of the Vietnamese modernist design vocabulary. The book is entitled Poetic Significance and is published in English language. Rain shells above openings or hoods around windows also provide shading over openings, as well as directing the torrential rains away from the openings. The floating roof was an interesting innovation of the Vietnamese modernists, since the flat roofs of modernism were the norm. the roof slabs would heat up significantly and transmit that heat to the interior spaces below. The Vietnamese architects resolved that by providing a double roof with a layer of ventilated air between the hot roof slab and the ceiling of the interior spaces below. In the case of the classroom building shown here at the Vinh Lam University of Technological Education, constructed in the early 1960s, the double roof is fully expressed on the primary facade of the building, while it slopes back towards the rear of the building. Note also the ventilation louvers along the facade of the building over the windows. The large projects designed by Vietnamese architects, with a few exceptions, were not air-conditioned and depended upon natural ventilation through ventilation screens or louver openings. Vietnamese architect Trần Đình Nguyen had studied hospital architecture in the USA in the early 1960s under a grant from UNICEF, but realized that the centralized air-conditioned designs common in the USA were not feasible in Vietnam during the mid-century due to high costs and especially the high cost of electricity to run air conditioning. So he became the foremost hospital designer in Vietnam in the mid-century using decentralized plans that allowed effective use of natural ventilation and centralizing the functions that require air conditioning, like operating rooms. These prime concepts are still used in Vietnamese hospital design today. This particular mid-century modernist design is a ward health center. Even today, Vietnamese public schools are rarely air-conditioned, relying upon natural ventilation and double wall construction to shade the exterior walls and openings. Although it is a mid-century design, the Lê Lợi Middle School is a good model for what is being constructed for schools in Vietnam today. Notice the ventilation louvers above the openings in the exterior wall, shaded by brise-soleil elements suspended from the spandrel beams of the exterior corridor above. These school layouts are usually single-loaded exterior corridors, and the classrooms have ventilation louvers and windows in the opposite exterior wall to provide cross ventilation. As air conditioning became easy to install in new buildings and existing buildings at a reasonable cost, Vietnamese architects over the past 2 decades designed modernist shophouses that mandated use of air conditioning because no ventilation louvers were provided, and windows often became fixed glass. These designs continue to be modernist, but use a richer palette of colors and materials than in the mid-century, but without the shading elements that we have been discussing here. This is unfortunate because the interiors of these shophouses have become like caves due to the lack of openness that mid-century modernism provided. Up until recently in Vietnam, there were frequent half-day power outages because the power grid was oversubscribed. We have been warned that Vietnam will be returning to this situation in a couple of years. When this happens and you live in these contemporary houses, you have to leave and find a cool cafe to sit in at a location where power remains available. Even in older shophouses, including mid-century houses, Vietnamese people have closed up the ventilation openings in order to install air conditioning in specific rooms. In his paper on tropical comforts in Vietnam, Professor Erik studied the Binh Thanh house, designed in 2013 by Vacham Nhia architects and Sanuki and Nishizawa architects. He focused on the hybrid nature of the innovative design that had portions of air-conditioned private space and portions of open, naturally ventilated living space, as described by the architects. Erik came to the conclusion that a combination of natural ventilation or air conditioning can be used in all areas of the house. The private screened floors can be open if desired, or closed off for air conditioning as originally intended. The open living floors can be wide open or closed off with sliding glass doors, especially at night. In the section drawing, you can see the more open floors alternated with the more closed-in floors. It is ironic that the beautiful concrete brise-soleil full wall screens enclose the presumed air-conditioned spaces when they should naturally be providing ventilation. But there are sliding glass doors available immediately behind the brise-soleil facade that can be opened wide when natural ventilation is desired. The open living floors are deceptive because they can also be closed off with sliding glass doors to allow air conditioning to function. You can see the air conditioner mounted on the wall, as well as the stack of sliding glass doors on the left and the right. There are times when we want to close the glass doors, such as during the night hours for security, as well as to keep rodents and feral cats out. But you still want natural ventilation without having to use air conditioning. That is impossible to accomplish in this house, as well as in most contemporary modernist houses in Vietnam. In my own house design, I tried to solve that problem by providing louvered glass windows at the tops of all the cross walls in the house that can remain open at all times. Therefore, I have ventilation breezes coming through the entire length of the house, even when the doors are closed. The glass doors can be closed when desired to keep out inclement weather, as well as animals. Security is provided by installing a steel cage screen on the outside edge of the floor balconies. I would rather live in a bird cage than a jail cell, like in all the houses of my neighbors. In most shop houses, steel security grids are installed on the inside face of all windows and doors. I spoke with Shunri Nishizawa, the architect of the Bintan house, and also its inhabitant, since both his family and his office occupy the space. When you live in a completely open or naturally ventilated house, you come to recognize the trade-offs you have to make to achieve this goal. You have the rodents and feral cats to keep out, flying insects moving through the house, loads of dust, wind-blown leaves cluttering the floors adjacent to openings, as well as the contemporary problems of ear-splitting karaoke and increasingly bad air pollution. I have all of those problems in my house, but I would still rather live in an open, naturally ventilated house. In practice, I have to close up and use air conditioning when the outside air is too unhealthy or the temperature gets up to 34 degrees centigrade or more. My computer always lets me know when it is too hot. I think it is unfortunate that so many contemporary modernist houses do not use the techniques for mitigating the tropical climate that we have been discussing here. But there are stirrings in Vietnam towards a new architecture that fits the more holistic nature of the information age we now live in. A good example is the Termitary House in Da Nang, designed by Vietnamese architects Trân Thị Ngu Ngo and Nguyen Hai Lam of Tropical Space Architects in 2014. They looked at the nests of termites to see how they might mitigate the temperature extremes. This method of developing a holistic design is called biomimicry, learning from nature to inform how to solve complex human problems. In this case, they learned that the termites produce double walls in their nests with small openings to moderate the temperature inside the nest in relation to the outside conditions. In the tropical space design, this is manifested in parallel brick walls laid in a pattern that results in thousands of very small openings for ventilation. The space in between the walls is used for service spaces. No air conditioning is necessary in this house. The exterior of the house is just one big brise-soleil screen enveloping the house. New designs are using the old techniques, especially ventilation blocks and screens, but in new ways.